Alright, Video Game Growing Pains here for one last hurrah before we change eras. We talked about Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, and Tactics. Now, need to talk a little bit about the unusual games, namely the Chocobo games and the miscellaneous Final Fantasy titles, or rather the titles tangentially related to Final Fantasy. See, back in the 1990s, Squaresoft was a huge name and Final Fantasy was branching out. It was so popular that they created a few spin-off series, namely the Chocobo series. I've not really played them that much, so I'm going to keep this brief. I don't want to be talking about something I haven't played. They created Chocobo's Dungeon, Chocobo Racing, and following in the PlayStation 2 and 3 era, and the Wii era, they created the Final Fantasy Fable series, which were very much like the Chocobo series. The Chocobo games were meant to be Final Fantasy Light, Final Fantasy that kids could get into. These were much better introductions to the magic and the world of Final Fantasy than Final Fantasy Mystic Quest had ever been. They were cute, but they were still very enjoyable and compelling. The Chocobo Dungeon games, which appeared on the PlayStation 2, and the Wii, were very much roguelike dungeon games. They focused on randomly created levels, and the Chocobo having to go through it, taking one step and one turn at a time, trying to get things sorted out. It's a very difficult genre to get into because you have to think very strategically. Everything you do, from item to movement, is one move, and you have to be very careful about that. So I think it might have been a little hard for kids to get into, but honestly, the graphical style is quite appealing. Even the PlayStation 1, which was still a little blocky and ugly at times, but it was very cute, very nice, and very appealing. The one game in the Chocobo series that I did play was Chocobo Racing, and I loved that game to death. That game basically was, hey, you know Mario Kart? What if we made Final Fantasy Mario Kart? And it was glorious. You take all of some of the standard trope worlds of Final Fantasy, like the world of magic, the mystic mountain areas, the cityscapes, and then you put some staple characters in there, like the white and black mage, Chocobo, Mog, Behemoth, Bahamut. Give them all unique abilities, and give them the ability to pick up magic on the track, which they can then use to blow up their enemies. It's really, really cool and really, really fun. My brother and I would play that to death, and we loved it. The story was weak. All of the stories in Chocobo are a little weak, but the gameplay and the graphics make up for it, because the graphics are just so warm, fuzzy, and fun. I really love Chocobo Racing. Haven't played the Final Fantasy Fable series or the other Chocobo Dungeon games, though. Final Fantasy Fables was released during the PlayStation 2 near the end, and the Wii series. It was also released on the DS. These games were meant to be very child-friendly and featured some similar aspects of Final Fantasy, but also some different ones. Final Fantasy Fables on the DS, for example, was very much about card battling, with Final Fantasy-esque cards. But it was meant to be kind of a younger generation's introduction to the world, and I could appreciate that. Chocobo games were meant to be introductions to the Final Fantasy world for a younger, less experienced audience. They were meant to not deal with all of the heavy story stuff, but to be just fun and quirky and adorable. And I can appreciate that. It was an attempt to try and get more blood into the series. But it was also an expansion, because the series had become popular that they, thought that they could expand it, not just, stick to the same niche genre with their experimentation. This was pretty apparent in Final Fantasy 7 and 8, where they did a lot of experimenting with the formula. Now, there's one more game in the series that is kind of Final Fantasy. It's called Ehrgeiz. This was a fighting game, sort of like a 3D Street Fighter that Square had made. They tried this before with something like Tobal No. 2, but it was not a genre that they were very good at. Still, Ehrgeiz was interesting because it had 6 Final Fantasy characters in it. You had Cloud Strife, Vincent Valentine, Tifa Lockhart, Sephiroth, and Red 13. You could also get Zack Fair if you want to count him. These characters were very fun to play as because their models were much better than in Final Fantasy VII, and it was a fighting game in a 3D world where you could actually use weapons, and you could take out Cloud's sword and have him just beat somebody to death with his gigantic sword. Same with Sephiroth. It wasn't a good game. The story was very stupid. It was basically people trying to get a mystical, magical sword for whatever reason. Kind of a very big Soul Edge ripoff. And getting the true ending was an incredible pain in the ass. But, yeah, I noted because it had good Final Fantasy characters. The other characters are sort of standard fighting game ones. They have interesting concepts, like a man who ages backwards, or a man with a fake arm that he can take off to reveal a gun, and when he runs out of weapon energy, he can just hit you with his fake arm. But the game was pretty generic. They tried to add some life into it with a Diablo-esque dungeon, which you could go down and get items and beat monsters, but it was just kind of tedious and didn't really add to the game, so Ehrgeiz was very forgettable. Notable for being the first Final Fantasy fighting game before Dissidia came onto the scene, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, the Chocobo games are heartily recommended. Ehrgeiz you can probably skip. It's not that big a deal. I mean, speaking of the Chocobo games, I still wish to play most of them, and I've tried to get the time and the games, but some of them are old and some of them are hard to find, so it's a little hard for me. And I don't really like the digital download, so there you are. Anyway, we've talked about the cinematic era. This is the era of Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, where graphics were taking hold, the storylines became much more grandiose, sort of like movies, and we got the rise of the cinematic, where in the game you would have cinemas, cutscenes that were computer generated, which you didn't have any control over. And this was probably where Final Fantasy was the most popular and the strongest. While they did sell a lot of games after this, this begins kind of this is the plateau of the series. 7, 8, and 9 were probably the highest the series would ever get, with the exception of maybe 10. After that, it was all downhill. So, next time we begin the fourth era of Final Fantasy, the era of change. Things are going to get weird. Stay tuned.